So, let's start with employer-sponsored insurance. Now, in employer-sponsored insurance, right? That's when you get your health insurance through your employer, and this became a thing in the U.S. because in World War II, the government froze wages, right? So World War II, there's the war is demanding a massive amount of resources, and the government is they're printing money, they're issuing debt to pay for that, and oftentimes during war, and World War II was no exception, inflation goes through the roof. And so, in an effort to tamp down on inflation, the government said you cannot raise wages. And so, but firms still wanted to compete for workers, right? They still wanted to give people better. They still wanted to get the best workers and can be able to compete for workers by offering them better wages, right? If there's a really good worker at your firm, I want to be able to try to poach them. And so the what U.S. companies started doing was, in addition to wages, they started offering health insurance. Where we'll say, hey, health insurance is technically not wages. So if you work for us, we can't change your salary, but we will give you health insurance. And that stuck around and has become really entrenched in the U.S. system, where today over 50% of Americans receive health insurance through their employer, right? And like I mentioned, this is not free, right? This is you should think of, when you're applying for a job and you're looking at health insurance, you should think of your health insurance as part of your compensation package, right? So what's your compensation package, right? That's wages. That's usually most of your package, but it includes health insurance, right? So your health insurance in some ways is taken out of your wages, right? Your premium is going to be taken directly out of your paycheck, and this is before taxes. So this creates an implicit subsidy for insurance because you don't get taxed on, right. So if you pay, if like, right. So when I was at the Fed, because I don't really pay taxes anymore, my income's too low. But at the Fed, I paid a fair amount of taxes. But the money that I put into my health insurance was not taxed. So this created an implicit incentive for me to invest in my insurance because if I put money, if I used my money to buy health insurance, it counted for more because it was never taxed at any point, right? And so this creates an implicit subsidy for employer-based insurance, where again in the U.S. It's employer-based insurance is effectively subsidized because income that you would be using to buy insurance on the private marketplace is instead not taxed if you get it through your employer, because your employer just takes the money out of your paycheck before you receive it. And so this side note is possibly really important to keeping the U.S. system functioning. So there's a lot of questions about, between implicit insurance and all the really high healthcare expenses, and the fact that the U.S. still at this point does not have compulsory insurance. You don't need to be insured. Why hasn't the U.S. health insurance system collapsed? Right. That's a reasonable question that isn't obvious. The fact that we implicitly subsidize employer insurance so heavily may have to do with that. Because again, it's not an explicit subsidy in all cases, but implicitly, the money you spend on healthcare through your employer is not taxed, right? So when you get health insurance through your employer, the premium is taken out of your pre-tax income, and so you never pay taxes on the money you're effectively using to buy health insurance. Now, as I've mentioned, right? So your health insurance premium is taken out of your wages. It is not free, and that's a phenomenon called wage pass-through, and that's when the cost of a benefit is taken out of employees' wages, right? And so you may remember incidents, right, where taxes may be passed on to consumers, things like that. Wage pass-through is used in a lot of contexts in economics. In this context, wage pass-through refers to people having lower compensation in exchange for getting healthcare through their employer, right? So what employer-based health insurance is not free health insurance. It is part of your compensation package, and you should think of the total value of your wages as wages plus health insurance plus 401k plus all the other benefits your employer gives you. All right. So, employer-sponsored health insurance. How do they deal with pooling? Right. So health insurance is all about creating a risk pool so that if I get sick and you're healthy, we offset each other, right? How does pooling work for employer health sponsored healthcare insurance? Well, you pool with other workers in your company, and companies often offer several plans. So the Fed offered several plans, and so did the University of Maryland. And plans are allowed to charge different rates based on your age. And pooling tends to occur within plans and age categories, right? So the old pool with the old and the young pool with the young. Technically, it's worth noting that lowering frail employees' wages is illegal, right? But in practice, there's a fair amount of evidence this occurs, right? So, for instance, in 1976, Congress passed a law mandating that insurers had to pay for maternity coverage, and women of childbearing ages saw their salaries fall relative to other groups after that law was passed. And so right, even though right in theory you're charging everyone the same, right? So your health insurance is part of your compensation package, and so your pooling is part of your compensation package in some way. Um, Even though in theory you're pooling with everyone within the same age category as you, so all like the 20 year olds are gonna, all the people in their 20s are going to pool together. In practice, if I suffer frequent migraines, my wages will be reduced implicitly, sort of through backroom channels and shenanigans. My wages will be reduced, and that's how I'm going to, right. So even though my wages are going to be reduced, and that's going to be an implicit extra premium I pay for my insurance. Um, and that's going to reduce adverse selection because you're making the frail people pay more, even though it's technically illegal. More evidence of this beyond the maternity. So this is a study from 2009 by Jay Bhattacharya and his co-author Boondorf, and this is looking at sort of wages between obese people and non-obese people over time in the U.S. Right. So this is so you'll notice that for jobs that offer insurance, obese workers are paid less and their wage growth is lower. Right. So obese workers are frail. Right. They're much more likely to get sick than non-obese workers are. And so between 1989 and 2003, they earned less, right, in 1989, and they had lower wage growth, so the wage gap had grown by 2003. Now, you might say, okay, a lot of economists think this is either discrimination against the obese, or it's that, something about obesity is making you less productive. And what Bhattacharya and his co-authors say is actually neither of those stories is right, because when you look at jobs that don't offer health insurance, there's no wage differences between the obese and the non-obese. And so the way to think, and what's actually going on here is that even though it's illegal to do so, firms are in practice basically implicitly charging their obese workers higher premiums by lowering their wages, right? And we see this because the obesity, the thin obese wage differential only exists for jobs that are offering health insurance, right? So this is evidence that in practice, employers actually do find ways to sneak, like, secret unofficial premiums towards people who are higher risk, right? So they're going to pay obese people less, right? They might pay me less, right? They might find ways to pay someone who has chronic migraine less if they're paying for their health insurance, right? And so this is going to combat adverse selection because, right, otherwise you guys wouldn't want to be in a pool with me if we were all paying the same premium, right? Because you all have to pay for my $1,400 a month Qlipta to take care of my migraines. But if my wages are reduced because of that, and implicitly, right, that wage reduction is secretly actually a premium I'm paying for the healthcare, then actually I'm paying my fair share, and you don't have an incentive to leave the pool with me anymore. So why? So that's one reason why robust companies wouldn't leave a firm is because pooling is within is within age categories, so the young aren't necessarily subsidizing the old, and It may be that actually the frail do pay higher premiums in practice than the robust, even though on paper the sickly and the healthy are supposed to be paying the same premiums. In practice, that there's evidence that that doesn't happen. Um, the another explanation for why robust employees don't just leave for another firm that has less generous health insurance with a lower premium is something called firm specific human capital. What is firm specific human capital? That is knowledge and experience that's really relevant to one job, but is not relevant at another job, right? So this is sort of the ability to navigate the bureaucracy, ability to work with your boss and your coworkers. It may be it may be the systems the firms use really well. You might know their clients really well, and so these are skills that are useful to you at a firm, but are not useful if you switch jobs, right? So if you've worked at Google for 20 years and then you switch to Amazon, there's a lot of, how Google works specifically that doesn't apply to Amazon. And so you're going to be less productive at Amazon than you were at Google, right? And so this firm-specific human capital can encourage you to stay in a job, right? Because you get paid more by that firm than you would at other firms. And then then if your firm says you need to buy health insurance, you might be willing to take the hit and not look, of higher premiums if you're robust, and not look for a firm that's charging lower premiums because you have skills that are specific to the firm you're at, right? Firm-specific human capital is not the only reason why having employer-based health insurance might mitigate adverse selection. The labor market is far from perfectly competitive. And that's probably a good thing, actually. It would be really unpleasant to be a worker in a perfectly competitive labor market. And you might say, what do you mean? That sounds great. If you're in a perfectly competitive labor market, that basically means you have no job security, right? That means the moment, right, your firm, there's a few days where your firm doesn't have work for you to do, you're fired, right? And they'll hire someone else the moment they have work for you again, right? So in practice, the labor market is not perfectly competitive. It doesn't mean it's not competitive, but it's far from perfectly competitive, and that's probably a good thing. But because the labor market is not perfectly competitive, there is room for insurers, if employers offered, basically to want to abandon your employer sponsored insurance, you need to leave your employer. And so it may be, if you're robust, maybe you'd prefer if your employer offered a different plan than the one you're getting, right? You might want a less full but fairer contract. But your desire for that contract isn't enough to make you leave your job, right? So there are a lot of reasons why employer-based insurance may limit adverse selection. Firm-specific human capital is one of them. Now, what's the downside of employer insurance? Well, the first is if you don't have a job, you're out of luck, right? You can't get employer-based insurance if you don't have a job or if your employer doesn't offer it. But however, another downside is something called job lock, which this rather humorous cartoon illustrates. So what's job lock, right? This guy has a better job offer, right? He wants to go, but he's sick, right? He's broken his leg. And HR keeps him in his job because he needs his health insurance, right? So he may want to switch jobs, but he can't because of his health insurance plan, right? And so right, and job lock, right? It could be even if his new employer does offer him a health insurance plan, right? It may be he can't switch because he's in the middle of treatment, and the one employer, the employers the insurance plans the different employers offer have different coverage networks, right? So his doctor isn't covered by his new employer, right? And so right, there's a problem with job lock, which is where if you lose your job, you lose your insurance. So first of all, losing your insurance is bad, but also that might discourage people from switching jobs, right? And we think of people choosing to switch jobs as a good thing. It means that they're moving to a firm where they're getting a better offer, where they'll be more productive. And if they can't switch firms because they'll lose their insurance, that's going to reduce churn and turnover and mobility in the labor market, which is going to be it's going to prevent people from working where they want to work, and it's going to result in lower wages and lower overall economic efficiency. So job lock is the main price of employer-based insurance.